Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the AIIM Growth Partners podcast. Today, I'm lucky enough to be joined by James Weston, the co-founder of Forscie. And today we're going to be talking about what James and his co-founder are building at Forscie, with a specific focus being on insider threat. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Yeah, nice to be here.
And James, let's begin by giving the listeners a bit of an introduction to yourself. So I guess, can you take us back a step and give us a bit of an overview of your kind of professional background to bring us up to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I now find myself in the cybersecurity world, specifying or specifically targeted on insider threat. But actually, my career started a little bit earlier than that in law enforcement. So I spent about 8 years as a police officer in the Metropolitan Police Service. Towards the end of that, I was moving towards cybercrime, the cybercrime world. And so I went off to study a degree in computer science, applied computer science, and then managed to find my way into the private sector. And from there, I went to work at a SATCOM company, a satellite communications company based in London that has global satellite constellations, and was part of the founding cybersecurity team there. Worked my way up from tier one, tier two, tier three within the SOC up to management, primarily in digital forensics and incident response. And then because of my background in law enforcement, assumed the role of insider risk manager effectively and started building out much of the policies and processes and aligning the technologies that are required to do that effectively in a large organization. From there, I was working with a former colleague of mine who was working directly with me on the insider threat function, and we created something called the Insider Threat Matrix, which is an open framework for practitioners of insider threat to help conduct investigations, but it's expanded far beyond that now to much more broader insider threat domain. And off the back of that, we created a company called Forscie, which I'm working on today, and we've got a number of products that are in the pipeline.
Amazing. Well, I'm looking forward to kind of unpacking a little bit more and diving into what you're doing at Forscie currently. But you said it was a natural evolution, you going into insider threat. So talk around the kind of the experience that you gained in those 8 years in the police force and why, that's made you kind of a natural fit for insider threat.
Yeah, absolutely. So insider threat is an interesting subset of cybersecurity, and it's primarily interesting because it covers a range of different disciplines. So to be effective insider threat investigator, you need to be very familiar with SOC tooling and the cybersecurity landscape more broadly, because lots of the tools that you're using within a security operations center are dual purpose. You would use them also within the task of doing insider threat investigations, and obviously the digital forensics element of it, actually analyzing dead box forensics, laptops and that type of thing. There's lots of technology and a technical skill set that's involved in that. However, there's another side to it, which is the necessity to investigate people. And so it's unusual to have those two combined traits, to have the experience and knowledge and skill within the technical realm of cyber, and more specifically digital forensics incident response, and also have legitimate experience and exposure to investigating individuals, thinking laterally, using different sources of information to compile an entire image of what's occurred with an individual. So it sets itself apart from security operations centers traditionally in that regard. And so I found myself naturally gravitating towards that because of that experience in the police. And primarily the experiences, I won't go into detail exactly what I did within the police, but I was a uniformed police officer for many of those years. And doing that, you become very familiar with how to handle and manage evidence and interview individuals and progress cases forward, and using very different, disparate sources of information to piece together what has occurred. And of course, that can directly transplant that into what we do in insider threat, albeit we're dealing with a population that's much smaller. We're dealing with an enterprise environment. So we have, anywhere between a few hundred to tens of thousands of individuals that we're effectively policing in that environment in terms of insider threat. Of course, in law enforcement, we're talking about entire civil populations, so it's a much larger subset. But much of the experience and the knowledge that you gain from policing directly applies. It's just at a smaller scale. One of the most interesting things, of course, is if you're working within the police, you have access to a tremendous amount of information that members of the public do not have traditionally, and there's guardrails around that. Obviously, you don't have that in an enterprise environment, in a private setting. However, the guardrails are much less defined because the assets we're dealing with are owned by the enterprise that we work for, and therefore we have simultaneously fewer sources of information but greater access to them. And so there is a difference, but nonetheless the same principles and knowledge applies in both domains.
I mean, there's so many kind of things I wanted to kind of pull apart there that you spoke about. But I think if I'm kind of understanding correctly, I think when you look at like traditional SOCs and people that have maybe gone straight out of college or university and gone straight into these sort of technical environments, they're very focused on the technical aspects. But your kind of 8 or so years experience in policing, you look at the problem much more holistically. My kind of follow-on question from that is why do you think there's been so much more focus on the technology than insider threat?
Yeah, it's a really valid point, and I think it goes really to the root of the origins of cybersecurity more broadly. So it's in relatively recent times that we've taken cybersecurity in enterprise environments very seriously. We could probably both remember a period of time where cybersecurity wasn't such a front of mind for corporate leaders. Effectively, it wasn't as prevalent within the media. People weren't talking about it. It wasn't TV shows like there are now, popularizing the concepts that are around cybersecurity, certainly in an enterprise environment. And so there was a very slow ramp up in terms of cybersecurity more traditionally. There was a time where it was conceived that buying a firewall was solving all of cybersecurity, and we've bought a firewall and that's it, and we've bought an asset and that solves that problem. And then, of course, years later, we've learned that that's not the case, and we need people, processes, and technology to be implemented to effectively control external threats. Interestingly, with insider threat, it's a subset of cybersecurity in the Forscie's conception of insider threat, but it is relatively new. And I conceptualize insider threat being probably the early years of traditional cybersecurity currently today. And so lots and lots of innovation has been applied to more broader cybersecurity. So lots of money and startups and companies have created fantastic products which protect organizations from an external threat. And not so much has been applied to thinking about insider threats. And that doesn't mean to say there isn't companies and innovation to some extent in that world, but it's largely limited to endpoint agents, user behavior analysis, that sort of thing, behavior detections, that type of thing. We've not really delved much further than that. So we're still in that mindset of a traditional cybersecurity operations center. And so it's a nascent field at the moment that as we've already alluded to in terms of those two different sides of the discipline, we've got the investigative side and we've got the analytical technical side, which is unusual to find that within individuals within a SOC, and even fewer then move into insider threat. And it's still not really landed what is required for that role, and we're still working that out as a discipline. So yeah, if I remember your original question, there is a dearth of innovation within insider threat specifically, and I think it's because it's not really been defined, and we're still in that defining process as we were 10, 15 years ago with traditional cybersecurity. It will get there, the necessity will be seen, and then therefore the innovation will follow. So we're still now thinking of it from a technical point of view as we were traditional cybersecurity all those years ago, and we just need to catch up. And that is in part why we're doing something like Forscie in the Insider Threat Matrix, is to try and put those, to bookend what insider threat is and what it means, and start defining terms, defining what we're actually doing. And then what we're going to be creating is training to actually train individuals in either the digital forensics side of things or the investigative side of things, depending on what you're deficient in. And so we want to create holistic people that can work in these environments and do insider threat at a very high level and know what to expect in terms of tooling, processes, and what they expect from the organization to actually do that function well. We will get there. It takes some time, but we're in the early days of it.
And talking about that evolution, because I think this is such an interesting, fascinating thing. To your point, cybersecurity is in the news kind of every day. It's front and center. So on that, when we're looking at insider threat, you mentioned how we've evolved and it's something that's front of mind for people. Where do you think the market's at in terms of the maturity and their sort of willingness now to, look at security more holistically?
Yeah, that's interesting. So what we're seeing, we put the Insider Threat Matrix out there. It's free to use. It's an open resource, and we accept public contributions that we vet to build out that framework. So it's very much like MITRE ATT&CK, effectively. So we just put it out there. We didn't really push it or anything like that. And it's been interesting to see which companies have taken it up. And so that gives us a good insight into which organizations are kind of ready to take insider threats slightly more seriously. If you're looking for a framework for insider threat, you're probably in an organization which is investing in that world and is yearning for some innovation in that world to see what's new. And so what we're seeing, and it's probably unsurprising, is that the largest companies that you can imagine are the ones that seem to be most engaged. And so, of course, they have the biggest budgets to do this, but they are domain leaders. So as they move forward and invest in these different parts of cyber, so again, taking that more holistic view, not just thinking, okay, now we've got a SOC, we've solved it. Now we need to think more specifically about different disciplines within broader global security. Others will follow. And that's what we're seeing. So we're seeing the largest private organizations you can imagine that are interacting with us in terms of the insider threat matrix. And we can assume that they are therefore ready to receive further services and platforms and products in that world because they're looking for it.
So let's move on then to how Forscie is specifically helping. If we look at the kind of enterprise environment, first of all, because you said that's who seems to be taking it most seriously for now. How does Forscie now, and how do you envision in the future that you're going to be helping these businesses with their sort of insider threat?
Yeah. Forscie is relatively new, so it's been less than a year that we've been working on it, but we've been extremely busy. The first product that we're producing is called City, so it's Certified Insider Threat Investigator. It's a course, as I described previously, which is training both the investigative element as well as the digital forensics side of things, combining it together and with the Forscie ethos behind it. Whilst we're doing that, we've created something called the Forscie Knowledge Center, and we're very much focused at the moment in trying to define insider threat. So we want to define terms and terminology and processes that we know are useful to enterprises from experience and from the contributions we've had and the conversations we've had on the back of the insider threat matrix. We are starting to see where those gaps are and where people aren't so sure. And so we genuinely, at the moment, want to be open and provide this content freely for people to use because we do really see that we need to define this space more so people know where to go and what they need. And so what we're finding, I'm going slightly back and you can remind me again to move forward. What we're finding is in those very large organizations, some have huge teams that are specializing in insider threat, others that are extremely large organizations but have a much smaller team, so probably smaller than you might imagine. And so there's lots of siloed experience within these different organizations that didn't previously have a mechanism to communicate with each other. In fact, it's so much so that they didn't have the same names for those departments. In some places, they're called intellectual property protection. They might be called insider risk program. They might come under physical security. They might be someone nominated within the SOC to deal with this. There's not really a cohesion around this. And so jumping back forward to your specific question, in terms of Knowledge Center, we wanted to put this stuff out there. We have a Knowledge Center articles, and it's not a blog, it is the academic articles that we're putting out from different concepts that we have pieced together under the Forscie umbrella. And we have something called the Forscie Glossary, which is defined, it has literal glossary terms for what we mean when we say insider risk, insider threat. We refer to subjects, we might refer to volume infringements, concepts that have come from Forscie. So in the first instance, we're creating this core knowledge basis. That's what we want to do. And then we're infusing that into the training course we're creating called Certified Insider Threat Investigator. And then beyond that, I can't talk too much, but there's other services that we're going to provide. As you might imagine, we have a software project that we're working on, which is I can't talk about, but it's novel. It's not something that's been seen in this space, and so it's pulling on that strand of we want to provoke innovation in this space, and there's a dearth of it. There's so much to do. Forscie can't do it all, but we're hoping that we can at least start defining things to the extent where others might look inwards and then see we can do that better, we can do this better, and we can do this better. And this is genuinely born out of a concern that organizations are missing a huge chunk of their security posture through insider threat. I mean, one of the things that we often say, and is something is a bit of a motto for Forscie, is that we have spent millions securing the border of our enterprises. We have spent years and years and years perfecting that. And now we have technologies that are going to make that even better. And therefore, our external adversaries are seeing this, finding it more difficult, more expensive, and more time consuming to compromise the perimeter. So naturally, they're going to move to insiders and recruiting insiders because it's a much softer target. And we've not spent anywhere near as much money or time or effort securing that environment. And so our prediction, and it's obviously we want to capitalize that financially in our business model, but it's unfortunate because we really do see in the coming years this becoming a bigger and bigger and bigger problem. And we do genuinely want to solve this because these are institutions we all rely on. These are household names that we use day to day. There's companies we are dependent on for our way of life that are seemingly vulnerable to this. And I'm heartened to know that they are taking it seriously to the extent where they're seeking out something like the insider threat matrix. But we do need to the market needs to provide more solutions. And those of us that work in this space that have the means to do that, it's incumbent upon us to actually find these gaps and try to solve them as quickly as possible. And with Forscie, what we're doing with that core knowledge basis and then the training, that initial ramp on into the market is trying to help that genuinely, is to put this stuff out there for free so that we can start shoring up what we've got in terms of cybersecurity inside the threat world. And then we can innovate in that space to then provide the services we know are going to be needed.
As cliche as it sounds, it does sound like a real kind of blue ocean opportunity, for want of a better phrase, in that you're not another kind of plug and play tech point solution, nor are we a security awareness training provider that we can tick that kind of corporate checkbox. How are you amplifying your message and getting your name out there so you can get in front of more of these organizations?
Yeah, so far it's primarily been through the insider threat matrix. So we have been approached by many different organizations. We've done internal talks. I've done talks with large security vendors as well to talk about the insider threat matrix. And so what we're finding is what I like, especially, I'm not a natural marketeer. And so I come from the police and I come from SOX. And so, of course, all of us, if we run a business, we have to some extent and have an appreciation for it. But what I particularly like is if we have the opportunity to leverage something which is genuinely useful in the market and then to use that to then push our message further, then that's the best way we can do it. And we're not having to force this on anyone. They are coming to us and we are then using that as an opportunity, and they're requesting of us to come and talk about what we're doing, what the insider threat matrix means, what Forscie is doing, where we're going with that. And so we are basically relying on that. We've got lots of interesting concepts that we have in the Knowledge Center, which we are going to popularize a bit more and use that as a marketing leverage, but it is a genuine resource that people will find useful and are finding useful. And then we can also use that. So primarily what we're going to be looking at doing is doing much more, probably more along an academic track. So we're going to be doing talks at conferences, the conferences you might expect, or at least putting calls for papers in to do that, to talk about these relatively complex and technical problems that we're trying to solve with these concepts that we have, these hypotheses that we have. And the first one is something called behavioral drift, which is I've written about. We've written relatively academic article on that, and we're going to do talks based on that. And it can be quite technical, but we think that the cybersecurity world is ready for this because we have done talks already at Black Hat USA on the vendor track, where it was very well received and very well attended. And it was one of very few, if I'm right in stating, only talks on insider threat. And so there is a gap. There is very few people are actually talking about this, at least in the tracks in the actual talks themselves. So there's vendors there that are addressing insider threat, but it's not being discussed in a more academic manner from a practitioner's point of view. And I should make that distinction. It is being discussed in a more academic way in terms of behavioral analysis and from psychology, but not in terms of the delta between the technology, pure technology plays, those point solutions, and the actual humans that do those investigations. And so we're addressing that delta. And so yes, that's our plan, is to basically be as useful as possible, and then hopefully the market, and it has been so far, receptive to that, to invite us in and to put this message out there. And I think coming it from a genuine point of view that we really do want to help people solve this solution, because I am genuinely concerned that there is a problem here. And so that message, I hope, carries well and helps us to achieve, nominally a marketing angle to it.
But I find it interesting what you're doing, because it's incredibly different. naturally many of these vendors will probably be going and working with existing partners. They're saying, hey, what can you do on the insider risk thing? So that's a prime opportunity where it's the people are thinking about this now of actually, to your point, we're securing our perimeter, but we're not doing anything about insider risk. Is that something you can help with? Of course, they're going to turn to their vendors or their MSPs before they're going to turn to other people. And I think that presents a fantastic opportunity whereby you can be their sort of partners. And that's probably going to be an incredibly good way and aligned with what you were talking about there of how you can kind of grow your business.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, of course, so much of this in business is unknown, right? So we can do our best to produce solutions to problems that we know exist, and then to refine that as much as we can. How that is received and interpreted by the market, we do it day by day. And so we believe it's useful and it's being received as useful, and we're being encouraged strongly by people volunteering their encouragement to us. So yeah, we approach it from that direction. We believe this needs to exist. So for example, the insider threat matrix, that was based on no research. It's just we were practitioners, or are practitioners, in the insider threat space. There was no framework that was useful to us, and so we created one. And it turns out that we weren't the only people thinking that. There's actually tens of thousands of other people that actually thought that too. And it's just we created it and put it out there, and structured it in a very specific way. And then from that realized, okay, well, there's lots of other ideas that we've had. We're not seeing them anywhere. So let's put them out there, because we were right about this one, so we're probably right about the next one and the next one and the next one. And we will keep doing that, putting into the market what we believe should exist. To your point about EDR platforms, XDR, and that sort of thing, I'm very much of the belief that I've used many of these platforms professionally, and there are some that do it extremely well, EDR, for example, and some that do it in an okay way. I would never recommend, as an entrepreneur, creating a startup to create an EDR that basically mirrors what already exists. And because the cybersecurity world is so fertile, let's say, and there's lots and lots of money to be invested in products that companies will buy, that we're finding lots of duplication of software solutions and those point solutions. And I'm very much of the opinion that if someone solved a problem, I don't even want to attempt. They've done such a good job. They've done a good job. I know it's good enough. We don't need to, even though if they could do better in here or there or this sort of thing. I'm more of the opinion that I'll just send them an idea or a feature request, maybe implement this, and it'll be even better, because they've done it already. They've created what's fantastic. What I'm interested in doing is creating products and services that do not exist and we know should exist. And I think insider threat is a vast area where we're all very confused about what to do, and we kind of need some people to come together and decide, what do we need to do practically? What do we really need to do within enterprises? What solutions do we need? What people do we need? What processes do we need? And let's start defining this. And that's where we're at. That's what our plan is, and what Forscie is entirely intending to do.
If we take a step back to the kind of the history lesson or the evolution we were talking about before, insider threat is nothing new. This has been around for hundreds, thousands, however many years. But if we look at the kind of evolution of cybersecurity, now it is more in kind of mainstream media. And to your point, there's many more point solutions or enterprise solutions that are hardening the perimeter. So the natural kind of attack is through insider threat. What does that actually look like?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, and there's a lot of research that's been done on this, and there's probably people who can speak so much more eloquently about the different types and the motivations behind them, the psychology behind it. I can only talk from experience from what I've heard from industry peers who are actually hands-on conducting these investigations. So, of course, in terms of insider threat and in the insider threat matrix, we have a motives article. So we list out as many possible motives as you could imagine that can be used within the framework. And so, of course, at the most fundamental, we have insider threats that can be autonomous or they can be recruited, right? You can also have insider threats that are negligent, or it's an omission. Then there's no deliberate attempt to harm, but it ends up in some form of harm to an organization. Then, of course, there's that third party, that external actor exerting influence on an insider, which is probably the most concerning. So when we were talking about that, we've hardened the perimeter to prevent external threat actors. So now they're finding it easier, cheaper, and quicker to compromise insiders to then have actions on targets on their behalf. And so that's something that at the moment is preoccupying me, because what we know that exists an increasing amount of organized criminal gangs or criminal groups are co-opting or funding or at least working with traditional or more traditional cybercrime groups. And when that happens, if you've got a traditional OCG and a cybercrime group that are working together or are directly funded by one another or have some form of link, you naturally have an online-offline duality of their capability. And that's really concerning in terms of insider threat. So if you're thinking about protecting your perimeter, you're hardening your firewall, you've got some network layer technology that you're implementing, an offline attack to that is, well, only through an insider, right? You're unplugging that appliance or you're plugging something into the network, that sort of thing. It can only be through an insider or someone who's gained some kind of in access that a member of the public wouldn't ordinarily have. And so obviously our technology, if we've got a DMZ and we've got external facing assets, they're accessible over the internet and it's pseudo anonymous. Obviously that is kind of falls away with insider, right? If you've got this online offline capability of external threat actors, and this is criminal groups which we're speaking of, if they find it too expensive, too time consuming, or too much effort to compromise over the network in a pseudo anonymous way, then it's not so much to expect that in the future we could see coercion applied in the real world on insiders to have actions on targets within an enterprise environment. And you mentioned just now about that this is nothing new, that this has been going on for a long time. Intelligence services and the military have known and dealt with this for a very long time because it used to be the preserve of espionage primarily. As our lives and much of our society has become more dependent and interdependent on private enterprises and different enterprises providing those services to us, then of course that line has blurred. And we've known that somewhat with cybersecurity more broadly, because there was a time when, again, cybersecurity was largely the preserve of governments and militaries, and then it's moved to enterprises as well, where criminal gangs are taking advantage of it. So now we're moving into that phase with insiders. So there's many lessons to be learned from the military and espionage worlds where they were doing counter-espionage, is effectively, for want of a better term, insider risk management is this very similar thing into an enterprise environment. And so my fear is that we're going to see more and more organized criminal gangs using offline techniques to coerce insiders against their will to have actions on targets within an enterprise environment, launch this malware, and you've ransomwared your business. It doesn't even need to be, as we've seen in the media more recently, where there's revenue sharing. So trying to co-opt an insider saying, detonate this malware, we'll give you some Bitcoin if you do it. And that's, there are some insiders where that very well would convince them. You imagine you might have an insider in a very sensitive area of an enterprise where there is significant interest in gaining the level of access that they have. Maybe they might turn down being bribed effectively, but they may not turn down threats against them or the people they care about. And so I say this, and I've had to catch myself when I've said this publicly before, because I don't want to be giving ideas to our adversaries, but it would be remiss of us not to be honest about this, and that is a serious threat. And we are not prepared. Enterprise environments are not prepared for that in any way, shape, or form. And my suspicion is that this is going on currently, and we do not hear about it, or they've not been discovered. And I think that's probably the situation we are in. If you just see basic market forces, if you're an organized criminal group, you're there to make money. It's very expensive to compromise a company externally. Let's do it internally. It's natural to think they're going to go where they can maximize their profits, and it's easier to do. And that would be via an insider. Yeah, my major preoccupation is that online offline duality that we're increasingly seeing with organized crime groups and cybercrime gangs, and the impact that's going to have on insiders. And I hope I haven't scared you too much.
No, I mean, it's terrifying but fascinating as well. And there are so many things I wanted to kind of pick your brains on, but probably I'll do that off here so we're not kind of scaring everyone else. But I guess looking ahead then, what do you think has to happen? Because I guess the attack surface is only getting more. People are focused on all these kind of new shiny tools and objects, and AI is obviously getting a lot of the focus, and rightly so, with some of the governance and some of the security controls that it's raising in organizations. So what needs to happen to really kind of combat this internal threat?
Yeah, it that's the
Million dollar question.
multi-billion dollar
Billions.
question that is. Yeah. In the first instance, as I've already said, we need to start defining, we need to bookend what insider threat is, where the remit exists, and then who we need in place to do this. Of course, it's always tempting. You're probably aware of this. When you go into businesses, typically startups, they want to solve everything with some kind of point solution technology because it's the easiest thing to do. Buy this product, it solves this problem. That's obviously not the case. And certainly the biggest targets of insider threat are the biggest organizations with the most sensitive data, the most sensitive access to assets and services that we all rely on. So they're more mature in that regard. We need to start with properly identifying a governance structure for the ability to respond to insider threat within enterprises. And that's very interesting. We have a concept called Acceptable Use Policy Advisory Panel. And so that's a Forscie concept that we're consulting into businesses and are looking to do. So there's a lot of detail to that, but effectively it's providing a governance structure that combines different elements, different parts of the business, different business units that need to be involved in the insider threat defense or insider risk program. And so we're thinking what you might naturally think HR, legal, cyber need to be working in conjunction, or at least have pathways between each other to be able to collaborate on this particular risk. You need whistleblower programs. You need insider threat specific training. You need to identify people the most at risk of recruitment attempts. You need sufficient joiners, movers, leavers processes that take into account insider threat and the threat posed by malicious joiners joining the organization, or people incentivized to leave by stealing data in the process, or movers and moving within your organization to gain access. And again, they can be doing this autonomously, or they could be coerced into doing this. It's a vast challenge, but it needs to start with processes. It needs to start with policies. We need to understand that's why we need to bookend it. We need to understand what the remit is, and then we need to start defining those policies and processes that we need in place, and then we could start considering the people and the technologies that we need there to enforce it. And what we're seeing is talking into businesses, it is that piece that's missing. They've bought the point solutions. They may have individuals that are tasked with enforcing insider risk, insider threat, but they don't have the governance structure, the program level in place. That said, when we're looking at individuals that are tasked with this, we're seeing gaps in their skills and experience. They might be very talented in the investigative side, lacking in the technical side, or vice versa. And even with the technologies, sometimes they're being left to run unattended. They're not being enforced. And we're seeing this across the board. So I don't think there's any single organization which is doing this exceptionally well. Some are doing it better than others, but I don't think everyone's got it exactly right. And I'm not surprised, because we, as the discipline of insider risk, haven't actually coalesced on this challenge.
So I guess we focused and talked predominantly about kind of large enterprises. It's not something that's just reserved for these larger companies. They're the ones that have been expressing interest. They're the ones that have budget, but it's something also extremely relevant and important for smaller organizations to get right. So with that in mind, where would you signpost these smaller organizations to go to find out more information as to how they can kind of help and start taking insider threat more seriously?
Yeah, absolutely. In the first instance, I'm of course going to say knowledge.forscie.com. We've got lots of free resources that are present there for people to access and start understanding the real risk of insider threat. And of course, that you can just go to forscie.com or insiderthreatmatrix.org, and that's that free open framework. Lots of smaller organizations can use the insider threat matrix. You don't have to have a sufficient, even a large, broad-based cybersecurity program. You can have a nominated individual that looks at that, even to just start defining their policies. So within the insider threat matrix, there's 5 articles, one of which is infringements. If you just look at the infringement article, it's just basically a list of what should be in your acceptable use policy. And that's a very simple thing to do. Obviously, there's enforcement elements to your acceptable use policy, but if we start with at least defining what people can't do and should do and what the expectations are, that's a very good start, because lots of organizations don't even really address that appropriately. Beyond what we have, I would, if you're in the United Kingdom or even elsewhere, the National Protective Security Agency, I forget their URL, but they're a public body that is producing lots of free resources for small and medium-sized businesses around insider risk. And that's a fantastic resource for smaller organizations to certainly look at. And there's lots of self-assessments and things like that, and different guidance that will be very useful for them.
Great, because I know, as I said, we focus on the larger enterprises, but this is something I'm sure some of the smaller organizations know that they need to be taking seriously. But just to wrap up, James, look, I've really enjoyed having you on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to join me, join the listeners, and kind of educating us all as to the work you're doing and what the kind of the challenges you're looking to solve. Any kind of final thoughts before I let you go?
Yeah, I feel like I may have been a bit doom-mongery in this. There are people that are actively working to try and solve this problem. And fortunately, because of the lack of public reporting, it does seem to be relatively rare. I think that those numbers are soft that we're seeing, but it doesn't mean that organized criminal gangs are going to start knocking on everyone's doors, trying to convince them to give access to their enterprises. We're seeing this as highly targeted at the moment. Obviously, we don't ever want it to get to a stage where it's more broad. My final point is this is a very serious emerging threat. It has always existed, but I think it's being leveraged more and more and more, and we should expect more of it. But don't be too afraid. We are trying to fix this problem.
Okay, so I should be able to sleep well tonight, but yeah, still something I should be and we should be taking seriously. Look, James, once again, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.